You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I'm a scientist by academic history and spent a lot of time studying physics, computer science, and mathematics at university in Stellenbosch, Cape Town. Most companies today are capitulating and finding a middle ground between buying some of those resources to serve these applications that serve customers and renting some of them. This gives us an opportunity to keep the data internally on the continent and use it in our best interests. How do we keep our data insightful and valuable for us and useful for improving things on our own continent?
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Andrew Mori, who is CEO and co-founder of Deimos, which is Africa's leading cloud technology and professional services company based in South Africa. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm very well, thanks. Thanks very much for having me. What a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. How's your week been so far?
Not bad, quite busy. We are operating across 5 or 6 countries, working on different cloud-based projects, some international, some locally. And it's been pretty busy. I think the second half of this year has picked up quite nicely. Lots of customers unlocking initiatives and proceeding with plans that previously have been a little bit behind or they've held back on. So things are quite busy at the moment.
Brilliant. I'm sure we'll get into that further on in the conversation. So you've listened to the podcast and you probably already know what I like to do is start from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and just tell us a bit more about Andrew Mori.
Sure. Thanks for asking. So just on my personal life, I guess I'm a scientist by academic history, and I spent a lot of time studying physics, computer science, and mathematics at university in Stellenbosch, at the University of Cape Town, and the University or Rhodes University, but also conducting research, scientific research at the CSIR in South Africa, which is called the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research Facilities. And I think, cut a very long story short, I left academia to start programming, and I've spent a good decade or two programming across different countries, in particular the UK. Also spent a fair amount of time in the US in programming, and then returned to Africa. And I've spent a fair amount of time building engineering teams, pretty much from the ground up. And I did get an opportunity to join a high growth startup in Nigeria in 2014, where I had the privilege of contributing to the growth of a very large engineering team. I think we were at about 100 people when I joined, and we grew the engineering team to about 200, 300 people. And it was a wonderful experience living and working out of Lagos and just experiencing a thriving ecosystem of technologists and startups, and just contributing my little part to say the Nigerian tech ecosystem. And since then, I've returned to South Africa in about 2018 and started a company called Deimos that again is completely focused on engineering and technology talent in Africa. And we are using our expertise to help companies globally leverage technology in the right way. So I think that's my academic and working background.
Thank you for sharing that. I guess what's quite key or stands out for me is in terms of your experience working for high growth startups in Nigeria and then returning back to South Africa to launch Deimos. So what was the inspiration behind founding the company Deimos?
I think one of the biggest things that struck me as I entered Nigeria was how completely misunderstood, or how I personally didn't understand what was happening in Nigeria at the time. And I, in a way, naively entered the ecosystem without realizing a number of things, like the intellectual, technological capability and capacity that is currently available in places all over Africa. Nigeria is a big highlight, but there are absolutely other hubs like Cape Town, Johannesburg, Kenya, Ghana, even as west as Senegal. And I think that was probably the most surprising thing, is realizing how wrong I was about all of that. And the inspiration for Deimos came from the wonderful experience I had working with and building teams in West Africa. And at the time, it felt like I'd uncovered or discovered something interesting, something novel in a sense, and that the rest of the world didn't know. And if you think about where, let's say, American companies today, they talk about nearshoring. And so that, American companies will nearshore in LATAM. So in South America, they'll look for engineering talent. Traditionally in the UK or even in the US, their offshoring would typically go to Eastern Europe. So Poland, Russia, Ukraine, lots of Eastern European countries that have exceptional engineering talent, and even India. And that's generally the standard approach for finding offshore talent. And at the time, I'd spent in Nigeria, my eyes opened to the opportunity pretty much at the same time as Andela started, and a bunch of other startups in Nigeria that were created around that time started utilizing that talent. And even today, I think it's still the case where a lot of global companies are unaware of the enormous opportunity there is in Africa from that perspective. And I think that was one of the things, Tersa, the opportunity that lay in front of me in terms of helping grow and foster talent on the continent, and then using that talent to help companies and help projects globally and to compete in that market. That was one of the pieces of inspiration. The second one is a more general problem where, as the CTO, as the technology lead for a high growth startup, I'd run into several problems. And some of these problems, if I touch on them lightly, would be things like ambitious founders, ambitious board members or boards, investors, etc., and looking at the multitude of problems that engineering or technology leaders face. And that usually has to do with people wanting to go to market very quickly and best practices falling by the wayside naturally. If you're prioritizing time to market, expansion into new markets, and speed and agility, you tend to have to let go of quality engineering practices. And I think I have an opportunity to change that slightly, or at least move that needle in the right direction. And that ultimately led me to, with my wife and other business partners, to start the company called Deimos, whose goal is to help businesses use technology best practices in their best interests, and do so with African engineering talent. It felt like an opportunity to showcase what we in Africa have in terms of our capabilities, to put it on the global stage and compete with other countries.
Thank you for that. So, as you mentioned, the inspiration was from the experience of building teams in West Africa and seeing the opportunity, I guess the opportunity specifically in the cloud technology space. So for those out there who aren't familiar with what cloud technology is, can you explain it to us in very basic, simple as possible terms?
Yes, sure. So I think a lot of people misunderstand the cloud as storage, which it is, but it's a lot more than that. Let's talk about resources. And what I mean by resources would be CPU, or central processing unit, storage, RAM or random access memory or memory capabilities, network, databases, things like that. And so before the cloud, all of that stuff would sit inside of a private data center. Us engineers, we call it on-prem. And so what I mean by that is companies that are leveraging technology or tech-enabled businesses generally have applications. And these applications and data sets need to be hosted somewhere. And hence the word server. So typically we would buy a bunch of servers and put it in the warehouse somewhere or somewhere in an office. And that warehouse or that server would thus be connected to a network, that network connected to the internet, and ultimately be made either privately accessible or publicly accessible. And those applications would form a wide range of different uses. So things like authentication, websites, access to financial services, etc. All of that stuff needs resources. So, for example, if you log into your bank today, so if you go to the bank homepage or the application homepage and you log in and you end up looking at your bank balance, typically what happens in that scenario, there's a number of services, a number of applications that would be hosted and that would require resources. And so that existed prior to what we call the cloud today. And so in a cloud world, those resources are made available to businesses on a pay-as-you-go basis. So in a sense, it's like renting resources from another company as opposed to buying resources. So the pitfalls of buying resources would be things like, take a bank or an e-commerce or an edutech company. Their business is focused on those things in particular. It's not really focused on technology. And now these companies need to hire procurement teams. They need to hire infrastructure teams and niche experts to manage complex resources. And so most companies today are capitulating and finding a middle ground between buying some of those resources to serve these applications that serve customers and renting some of them. And I think the last topic, the last item to just comment on here is that when it comes to critical or business critical functions, like as a user, I should always have access to my bank account. These applications, they need to be highly available. They need to be redundant, resilient. And so what the cloud really offers is an extrapolation of the traditional hosting of applications. And what I mean by that is, in the traditional sense, we would buy some resources, we would secure it in a room somewhere in our office. But the point, Terse, is if there was a fire or a flood or a disaster, that stuff, it may have a backup plan, but ultimately it's a single point of failure. Yes. And the term cloud generally refers to a region, and a region has availability zones in them. And those AZs or availability zones are like copies of each other. So if a fire breaks out in one AZ, you still have your application available in the remaining two AZs.
Yeah.
And yeah, you get, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I've got a clearer picture or idea. So you've given us a description of what cloud technology is. So how would you describe the current state of the cloud technology space in Africa? I know we are speaking in general terms and it probably differs greatly from region to region, but I guess in general, how would you describe the state of the cloud technology space on the continent?
So that's a great follow-on question because I gave an example about a region. And if you extrapolate that, you would move over to the global network. And I think the largest amount of, or the most advanced cloud industries in the world would be sitting in China and in the US and Europe. And I'd say that Africa has been neglected from that perspective. But there are some really positive things happening. And the first one would be underwater sea cables that are now really tracking along the coastline of the entire continent, connecting Africa to the world in a high-speed internet, a high-speed connection. And what that investment has done is opened up the possibility for companies like Amazon Web Services, Huawei Cloud, Alibaba Cloud, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure to invest further into the continent. And what I mean by that is literally building regions. So at the moment, the only regions, and I mean public cloud regions in the whole of Africa would be there's an Amazon Web Services region in Cape Town. There's a Microsoft Azure region in Johannesburg. And that, remember, a region will have 3 data centers or 3 availability zones. And I'll talk about why that's important in a minute. And then there's a Google Cloud region in South Africa, and there's also a Huawei Cloud region. And I am fully aware that all of the public clouds that I've mentioned are looking at West Africa, they're looking at East Africa, and they're looking at Egypt for expansion of their infrastructure. So to answer your question, I think Africa has been relatively neglected from this perspective. And why it is important is it allows companies locally to leverage these resources in a way that allows them to host data internally in the continent. So prior to today, if you're a business operating out of Kenya or Nigeria, and you have critical customer information or critical financial data, and you are only using the public cloud and your public cloud is not available in your region, then essentially what I'm saying is your critical data is sitting in regions like London, Spain, Portugal, Europe, America, and the east of the world. So it brings up complications. There's latency complications. There's, the complications around things like international or currencies, and not being able to pay for international services in local currencies. And ultimately, I think, it poses a number of problems for high growth startups and for enterprises on the continent. And I think your question has been answered, but I do believe we are in a state of growth and that these companies are investing into the region, and that in the next 5 years, I have a very strong conviction that there will be multiple regions available to Africa that will benefit mostly end consumers and the businesses that serve them. So it's growing.
So you've slightly touched on this in terms of why do you believe more cloud regions across Africa are essential for the continent's digital transformation ambitions?
So I touched on the resourcing side, the traditional server, but the public cloud brings something else with it. And the other things that it brings, besides the items that I mentioned, the availability, the resilience, all of those features, it also brings services or a managed service or proprietary services that these big companies, these multi-billion-dollar, even trillion-dollar companies are providing businesses and end users. And what I'm referring to are things like next generation data and analytics services. And I'm also talking about things like artificial intelligence and access to large language models and access to next-gen AI. And these things are typically being pushed by these big companies into their networks, into their resourcing, and they are being made available. But for example, today, if you wanted to use Google's AI or Amazon's AI or any of these big public cloud providers, if you would like access to the forefront of technology, you typically need to make requests to Europe or requests to America. And it's these local regions that allow for the general availability of the same services that the Americans or the Chinese have access to being deployed on the continent in Africa. And why is that important? It's important because, Africa is a continent of opportunity. And, not only do we have a growing population, but we also have a growing data set. And I think, if we consider how valuable data is becoming, that I think it's imperative for our continent to take control and benefit from our own data. And what I mean by that is keeping some of this data internally on the continent, not hosting it externally and training models on our own data sitting in a London data center. So I think it's important from a privacy perspective, from a, I think I don't want to go into a political discussion, but for example, if you think about global, previous colonization, the modus operandi would be come into Africa, take the diamonds and mine what you want and take it back. You know what I mean, Tersa? So this gives us an opportunity to keep the data internally on the continent and use it in our best interests and not let other continents benefit from our growing continent. And yeah, it just kind of puts the power back in our pockets, and it allows us to be in control of our continent a little bit more.
I agree. I guess you've probably read or hear quite often data is the new gold or oil. It is a valuable resource that we have to maintain or keep within the continent. But you've talked about the obvious benefits of more cloud regions. What would you say are the current challenges of expanding these cloud regions within the continent?
I think the challenges are very clearly infrastructure related and geopolitical stability related. So, in South Africa, where I live, we've struggled with constant power issues. So I'm talking about electricity going on and off. And it's the same in West Africa and East Africa, and generally a typical problem that has plagued our continent for many, many years. And one would imagine that stable electricity is required for a highly functional data center. It's a power-hungry thing, and there are ways to mitigate against that hungriness, but it's definitely something that is a challenge on our continent. You would need extremely reliable and stable internet, stable electricity, as well as internet. And I think the internet stability has improved drastically, but furthermore than that, I'm talking about actual physical infrastructure, strong roads, security and political stability. That those things are all important. And if I was the CEO of Microsoft or Google, I would be taking all of this stuff into account before investing billions of dollars into a specific region. You want to make sure that your investment is looked after, and it's certainly difficult to do that in certain countries in Africa at the moment. I'd say those are the biggest challenges.
Interesting. So as you mentioned, infrastructure and certain geopolitical issues are the biggest challenges. So from your experience or from some of the success or work you've seen happen over the years, how do you think government and private sector can work together to accelerate the development of this cloud infrastructure that is much needed?
I think it really boils down to skills development, and in whatever way that can be facilitated between government and private sector. I would suggest that that's probably one of the biggest areas that would have an impact on all of this. The last thing we want to do is have foreign entities running local regions for cloud providers. I think there's a very strong case for job creation and network engineers, infrastructure engineers. A really big opportunity for jobs to be created in this entire escapade. And so skills development is one. I think the government needs to really take control of the stability of regions and the access to stable internet and stable power. I think that alongside of skills development would set our continent up for success.
You've touched on a key point there with regards to skills development. I guess a area that we can't ignore, which is closely aligned to cloud technology, is the AI market. And I think I read recently that Africa's AI market is expected to reach 3.8 billion by 2028. So what role do you believe cloud technology can play in shaping Africa's AI capabilities?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just want to step back a couple of steps. And I think the internet has been a great leveler for our continent in the sense that, let's be honest, we don't have the best tertiary education in the world. And a lot of candidates, a lot of young people tend to they make it through school, but the point is the internet allows young people to get access to information that can catapult their careers. And I've seen this firsthand, Tersa. So one of the greatest joys I've had helping foster talent on the continent is coming to the realization that there are young people that are teaching themselves very niche things like AI. So just before AI, I was completely blown away by working with self-taught engineers. And I mean engineers that have learned detailed technologies like cloud technologies like Kubernetes. So Kubernetes it's actually an orchestrator of containers. And what I mean in this regard is let's call it a new compute paradigm. It still runs on servers, but it's managed in an interesting way. And this technology was invented by Google many, many years ago, but that has been adopted. It's now ubiquitous across the whole world. Everybody is using Kubernetes as a compute paradigm. And, when we started Deimos in 2018, we started hiring in West Africa, and we found people that were internationally competitive, globally competitive on a skill set for Kubernetes. And they were aged 21, 22 years old. And it's just indicative of young people getting access to information and courses and online learning that results in huge career progression. And if you think about just that on itself, there's a natural progression into, say, today's state of the art or forefront of technology, which would be AI. And it's even more so now. So Tersa, if you're a young person in West or East or South or North Africa, and you've come out of a decent university where you have a strong or even school system where you have a decent background in the basics, mathematics, sciences, etc., you could easily, with some ambition, gain access to AI courses and learn and become trained in artificial intelligence, and then enter the global workforce as a very young person with 1 to 2 years experience with AI. And I've kind of almost lost the question, but I just think it's such a powerful notion to imagine how young people from rural parts of Africa are able to enter the global workforce on a cutting edge forefront technology like AI simply through learning online.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I think you've covered the question and more, because I guess the initial question was in terms of the role that cloud technology can play or is playing in shaping Africa's AI capabilities.
I think it's been a natural progression, people learning about cloud technology and then getting access, because that's really where, so every AI today, ChatGPT, Claude, all of it from Anthropic, etc., it's all being served from public clouds for basic and for the most obvious reasons, so performance, resilience, high availability, etc. So all of that AI is being run on top of public clouds mainly. Some of that data may have been trained on internal systems. You'll see, Elon Musk at the moment, if you look at Tesla today, they're busy installing some of the largest GPU clusters on the planet. And so that would be running inside of a private data center. But the access to those models, let's say are going to become available to drivers in cars, that AI is being accessed through a public cloud. And yeah, I think that, it's a natural progression. AI generally comes from data sets, and those data sets are typically also held and maintained and managed within big data lakes, in big data warehousing solutions, and the public cloud has a big part to play in that. And yeah, for our continent, just getting access to these kinds of things is important. So as a business today, I can be sitting in Rwanda and generating lots of business data or consumer-based or B2B data, and I could be transforming that data and doing, data manipulation on it and storing it inside of a data warehouse like Google's BigQuery, and literally using that data center sitting in Johannesburg. So as a business in Rwanda, I'm able to store manipulate, gain insights, run, models on top of this data set to produce AI that can also compete with other suppliers in the world.
Thank you for that. I guess it's clear that there is growth and increased access to AI technology and tools within the continent. But despite that, I guess the reality is a lot of people still see it, or what we've said during our conversation is that Africa is still considered one of the least prepared regions for cloud technology and AI. So what do you think are probably the biggest barriers to things such as AI adoption on the continent?
I think let's just address the elephant in the room. These things are expensive,
Yes.
and I wouldn't consider Africa as the most prosperous continent on the planet, and we are plagued by poverty in certain regards. And I think these things are expensive, and I mean, let's just talk about businesses that are growing and are on the up on the continent. They are being challenged by, devaluing currencies. And so these companies are, let's say they're working in Ghana, let's say a Ghanaian company, a Ghanaian startup or a Ghanaian bank. Today their cloud bill is $100. Well, if their currency devalues overnight, tomorrow their cloud bill is going to be $200. Well, not $200, but Ghanaian cedi will double. And so we struggle with instability on our currencies. And at the moment, all of these things need to be paid in international currencies like dollars and pounds and won. So I think that's a big part of what's preventing businesses from fast adoption or gaining broader access to things. Is these things are currently quite expensive. And we need, like we mentioned earlier, so we need governments to provide stability, and governments need to produce good infrastructure so that our economies may flourish and our currencies remain stable. And yeah, I would say that that's a really big part of it. And we have touched on the other areas, infrastructure issues, skills development, and lack of, it's uncommon. I mean, I mustn't speak out of turn, but I don't think it would be that common to walk into a secondary school in a rural place in Africa and see, fundamental AI being taught at the school level, never mind the university level. So we're on the back foot, but I don't think we're going to complain about it. We're definitely on the back foot, but the only way out of this is through it. And I think, it's a combination of private and public sector working together to address these fundamental problems that, if they are addressed, or even slightly improved, it'll make it easier for businesses to try new things and invest in new initiatives and adopt cutting edge technologies.
It's true, as you mentioned, these things are expensive, and one or a couple of the things we can do to reduce cost is to improve the infrastructure, and as we touched on earlier, upskill local tech talent. So maybe we can touch upon that in terms of, we haven't really spoke about the work that you're doing, some of the work that you are doing at Deimos in terms of contributing to the efforts of increasing and upskilling local tech talent. Maybe we can talk about that.
So what's also interesting is, the opportunity, like I mentioned it already, but if you think about the problem, and the problem is, this is just my opinion, that I don't think we need to be worried that AI is going to overtake all of our jobs simultaneously. I think AI will eventually and slowly start replacing aspects of the current job force today, but not in a super negative way. It'll displace things in such a way that skilled workers will adopt new things. And, as a software engineer, there's a lot of information today that points to all engineers being out of a job and your jobs being at risk. And, nobody really knows the future, but I am trying to say that this skills lack, this is a global problem. And sometimes these problems present opportunities. And what I mean by that is, here in Africa, we have a lot of smart people that are gaining experience, that are learning these new skills. And it's these people that are going to fill the gaps in the global workforce that's under pressure. And what's interesting about it as for us as Africans is that we would be competitive on pricing as well. So let's say a senior software engineer, and Deimos employs interns, juniors, intermediates, seniors, staff level, principal level, and upwards. So if you look somewhere in the middle, let's say a senior software engineer, which is a really high level to get to. If you want to be globally competitive or globally acknowledged as a senior software engineer, it's not normal to see someone with less than 5 years experience get to that level. It can take up to 10 or even more. But let's say you're at that level. In Africa, you could earn, between $3,000 and $5,000 for that level on a monthly basis today. But an engineer of that level and skill sitting in the US or in Europe would want to, look for salaries up to 8, 9 to 10, or even double as expensive as that. And so that presents an opportunity for us because, locally things are not as expensive as, living in San Francisco, or as you would know, living in London is a little bit more expensive than living in Cape Town or Lagos or Kenya or Ghana. And I think, that puts us in a strong position. We are more competitive in that regard. So, there's multiple opportunities for talent to excel on this continent. And what I wanted to just talk about is that it's not a local issue. As I say to my team, where do the senior engineers come from? Because there's a limited amount of senior engineers, and definitely principal, etc. There's a limited amount of these people on the continent today. And so the answer is, tomorrow's seniors are today's juniors, right? So somebody needs to invest into the junior ecosystem and train them up to become seniors, and that's where they come from. They don't just come out of thin air. And I think companies like Deimos or companies like any one of our customers have a obligation to invest into skills development. So it's in our best interests. And the honest answer is, there isn't another way. You can't. I mean, one could attempt to poach talent from other companies, and companies do that, and that's just natural. But it's a zero-sum game, right? It's closed loop. There are only 100,000 seniors in the world, or I don't know what the figure is, like 2 million globally or 5 million globally, and it's a zero sum. So if one company is stealing from the other, the number stays the same. And so what I'm alluding at is all of us in the world globally have to invest into internship programs and training juniors. And so, at Deimos, we've known this for a long time. We sponsor nonprofits that, and I can mention a whole number of them, that are focused on getting engineers into junior positions. And a lot of companies are adverse to stuff like this because it's very expensive to invest into a junior, and there's also a risk involved in that, Tersa. So I've personally been on the receiving end. You spend a lot of time and effort and money training somebody up, and as soon as they're good enough, boom, they jump ship, and now they're working at Tesla in America, right? And so but that's just par for the course. You can't avoid it, and it's really our duties to. I think it's our obligation as businesses to do that.
So, I guess keeping on the theme of talent, all of your expert hires are from Africa.
That's right.
Is this something that was done intentionally?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Yes, it was.
And what was the motive behind that?
I think it goes back to that inspiration that I received working for a high growth startup and coming to the conclusion that I was completely wrong. I guess, look, we're talking 10 years ago, and things are very different today. I mean, I'm of the opinion that most people who know anything about Africa will have a very different picture today than they did 10 years ago. But I would say that, I don't think, most people in America, in Europe, wouldn't have thought about Africa as a source of talent. And it's glaringly obvious that it is the next the next largest workforce, and a very capable one at that. And so, yeah, I think it was just putting your money where your mouth is and saying, hey, we know this is an opportunity. There's no reason why we can't compete globally using African talent, and that's what we set out to do, Tirsa, and that's what we've done. And yeah, I can tell you unequivocally that it's worked and it works. And Deimos's engineering team is extremely strong. And what what's interesting about that as well is that it gives people the opportunity to stay on continent. So we talk about brain drain, right? So as a medical doctor, I know that Nigeria or South Africa or Kenya, we've trained really strong doctors, and these doctors typically end up being attracted by universities or hospitals in more mature markets for bigger salaries and the promise of a more stable environment. And I'm sure that's worked for the individual, but as a continent, I think we need to do what we can to fight against that, and being able to provide people with high-paying jobs, from being able to work from home, being able to stay in a country of your choice. I mean, I know a lot of Africans who have left the continent, not because they don't like Africa, but it's because they're looking for a more stable environment, for a harder currency. And I just think, for example, at Deimos, we pay everybody in dollars, and it mitigates the risks that come with earning in a local currency. And it gives people the opportunity to stay in the country. And so I'm telling you right now, there are like 20, 25 people at Deimos that if they weren't able to work at a place like this for a high-paying salary in an international, they would have left the continent already. But what's happening is these individuals who I'm very close with, they stay. They're staying at home, and they're spending their money at home, and they're supporting families and businesses, and they're starting things locally. And so I just think it's a good hedge against the brain drain, is doing things like we're doing.
Interestingly, I still have conversations with people who talk about or complain about skills shortages on the continent. So I was wondering, how do you approach talent acquisition? Because you don't seem to struggle finding the talent in such a niche industry.
I don't want to speak like an expert on it, because I'm just lucky in a sense to be working in the cloud, and so it's very attractive to young technologists to be able to. So I mean, even let's say that South Africa has a slightly more mature engineering market than the majority of the rest of the South Africa or the African countries. But even in South Africa, even today, when I speak to some of my seniors about jumping from project to project, they don't want to work on old technology. And, even today, there are companies, public companies that have really outdated technology stacks. And so, let's say, I'm just going to give you a fictitious example, like, let's say an old traditional bank in South Africa, potentially running on a language like Fortran or Delphi or something that would have been deprecated 25 years ago. Nobody really wants to work on that. Young engineers or engineers in general, they want to be working on, next gen, cutting edge, bleeding edge technology like AI and machine learning and just generally, new and interesting languages. So I think being able to provide people with access to exciting, cutting edge technology is a great attractor. I think that's one of the things that is attractive about working at Deimos. And so I just feel like I'm lucky to be able to offer that to people. And so that is a big part of people being able to attract people. The other is is two things, like I've already touched on. Earning in a currency that's not devaluing on a monthly basis is a huge attraction. And secondly, and that's also again a lucky thing, right? I can't say that every company has that privilege. If you're a big workforce in Kenya, you're typically paying people in shilling, and you're earning in shilling and therefore paying in shilling, and it's those employees are at risk of their of their currency devaluing overnight and things becoming more and more expensive for them. So I have the privilege of being able to pay in dollars, which is a great attractor. And then the other is the permanent remote working. So, pre-pandemic, 2018, we made a decision to build a company that allows employees to work from anywhere in the world if they wish. And so, this work from home brings about a level of flexibility. It's very nice to hear of very senior people not having to ask permission every time they need to go pick up a child from a school or something like that. And so we've built a very flexible environment that is attractive to young people.
Brilliant. So as you mentioned, a lot of the young engineers or people that you work with are wanting to work on next gen, new cutting edge technology, and also the trends that we're seeing in terms of work-life balance.
Yes.
So with that in mind, are there any current trends that you're seeing in Africa's cloud technology space that you're quite excited about?
The trend's been going on a long time. I think there's a cultural term called DevOps, and DevOps is a mindset. It's a set of practices that form a larger culture. I would say the discipline would be something like, it's called site reliability engineering, and I think what I've seen is a bit of a trend. Africa's been producing very good SREs, or site reliability engineers. And these SREs, and I'm speaking from my own experience. I can't speak from a wider perspective, but our SREs at Deimos are working at global companies in America and the UK, and we're seeing a great success. And so I think there's this this trend where African engineers are becoming stronger and stronger at the infrastructure layer, at that layer of the cloud, and that to me looks like quite a trend. There's another thing that I'm seeing, but it's not so much cloud related. It's just the greater the ecosystem becomes, the more successful businesses become, the more entrepreneurs it produces. And I've seen people talk about things like the pay stack mafia, or whatever you want to call it. So more successful companies that are utilizing the cloud produce people that are then going out and starting new companies, and it's just this general cascading pattern that I've noticed on the continent.
Thank you for sharing that. So if we go past current trends, look into the future, where do you see Africa in the next 5 years with regards to how the cloud technology space will evolve? The infrastructure, how would that look like?
We're playing catch up. So from a realistic sense, I think what I mean by that is, I'm of the opinion that the public and private sectors across all countries hopefully will be heading in the right direction, slightly more stable infrastructure, more attractive international investment, and cascading effects like skills development and so on. So I think we probably are playing a bit of catch up, but long term, I think we're in a really unique position. I think our data, the data that our continent is generating, will be unique and ultimately valuable. And I think this is something that all of us need to think about. How do we keep our data insightful for us and valuable for us, and useful for improving things on our own continent?
So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and Deimos in 5 years' time? What role do you see your company playing in shaping Africa's cloud technology space infrastructure?
The controversial thing that I was saying is that I think the world is maybe overcommitted to deploying things in the public cloud. And I believe that not everything that's currently being pushed in the cloud needs to be in the cloud. It can be a really expensive place. And I think there's an opportunity to find a bit of a balance. And what I mean by that is, so I see Deimos really helping companies understand how to use the public cloud in the right way. But also I see Deimos building local solutions for cloud services. And so I'm not going to say much more than that. I just feel like there's a big opportunity to solve Africa's cloud resources problems in a unique way. And it does include moving things back into private data centers, into this hybrid multi-cloud state. And that's something I'm pretty excited about.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Yeah, I think, look, it's going to be boring to talk about this from a Nigerian standpoint, but it's something that I learned in Nigeria. And it comes from Fela Kuti talking about suffering and smiling. And I think, that resonated a lot with me in my time in Nigeria. And it helped me gain perspective on things. And I'm just suggesting that, while we are struggling on the continent and we are playing catch up, that we can do so in a fun and exciting way. And it doesn't all have to be negative. And I think, the world has painted aspects of our history and aspects of our current state in a really negative light. And I think it's on us to show the world that, while some of that may be true, that there's enormous beauty and enormous potential, and something that we need to showcase and show the world.
I agree. It's about that resilience and also seeing the positives in as many situations as possible, which is definitely an African mindset and also a entrepreneurial mindset as well, which kind of go hand in hand. So thank you for that, Andrew. We've come to the end of the conversation. It's been a fantastic conversation. You've shared a lot of insights from, how Africa's AI future is being shaped by cloud technology, and also the importance of investing in cloud infrastructure, upskilling local talent, and a lot more. So thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure is all mine. Thanks, Tersa. Thanks for all the time and wonderful questions. I appreciate it.
And we will speak soon.
Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.